White? Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And so can we take roll just to keep track of who's in attendance? Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Assemblymember Buchanan.
Here.
Assemblymember Hagman.
Here.
Esteban Almanza.
Here.
Kathleen Moore. Cesar Diaz.
Okay.
We can begin.
Yeah, my understanding he will be here. So we just have 2 items plus public comment, but the first is discuss the issue of how classrooms are counted and loaded for the purposes of the determining the inventory for funding purposes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an item that we held over from the last meeting.
Right.
And basically is to talk about how we count classrooms and load them for purposes of determining eligibility under the school facility program, and then how we fund in new construction. There have been several comments that have been made about the way we currently identify classrooms. There's Title V regulations that may not be necessarily aligned with the school facility program regulations in terms of defining what a classroom is. So the question came up whether they should be aligned or not. And then we also have some questions as far as the loading standards. Currently, it's set at 25 pupils for kindergarten through 6th grades and 27 for 7th through 12, and whether we keep this traditional loading standard or switch to something different. So before we get started, just a brief reminder of how the program currently works. In terms of new construction eligibility, the definition of a classroom, the counting of a classroom is very important in determining eligibility. Basically, we take a look at all the classrooms and determine the district's total gross classroom capacity. So we take a look at what the district has in terms of classrooms and compare that to projected enrollment. If there's more projected enrollment than classrooms to house those students, then there is eligibility for purposes of new construction eligibility. Now, the statute has a broader definition of what a teaching station is, and then it is further defined in regulations. The regulations go further to talk about what types of classrooms are counted. And again, this is for purposes of the school facility program. Certain things that get counted are, types of classrooms that were funded through the lease purchase program, even classrooms that are included in closed schools. If a district has them in their inventory, we count them for purposes of the program. There's also some exclusions. So you have this gross classroom count, but then certain classrooms may be excluded, such as classrooms that are less than 700 square feet. So that's the way it currently works in terms of the classroom counts. Again, currently the loading standards are in statute, the 25 for K through 6 and the 27 for 9 through 12. And then the way we fund is basically when we get an application for funding, we take a look at the plans in that project and we count the number of classrooms as we currently define them, and then that results in a corresponding grant amount in terms of pupil grants. So with that in mind, we have a couple of options for the subcommittee to consider. And again, this is to consider something different than the current program. The idea with all of these options is to have a consistent model that is used both for determining the classroom count and determining eligibility, and also for purposes of awarding grants for new construction funding. So with that in mind, the first option is basically to get away from the traditional 4 walls and a door approach and look at teaching stations. Currently, there's an example on page 71. If you have a total area of 3,840 square feet that is divided by 4 identified classrooms of 960 square feet, we load each of those, if they're elementary, at 25 students per classroom. So that those classrooms, it would be 4 of them, and it would equate to 100 pupil capacity. On the right-hand side, we have the same total area, but the classrooms are of larger area. So there's 2 classrooms there, 1920 each, and each of those are loaded at 25 students per classroom. So in that situation, you have 2 classrooms with a 50 pupil grant capacity. So the concept behind option 1 is to basically go away from that traditional 4 walls and door approach to identifying a teaching station. And it's regardless of whether they're divided by 4 walls, it would have to be something that, the that is identified as a teaching station, and it could have changes to the way we currently do the classroom count. This is largely a shift in practice and policy, more so than in regulation in terms of especially identifying classrooms that are larger than 960 square feet. There isn't anything regs that specify how, so that's something to consider. At the bottom of page 71, there's some examples of how this could work. So the same, on the left-hand side, it's the same 38 to 40 square feet area divided by 4 classrooms and 25 students per teaching station, excuse me. This would result in 4 teaching stations for 100 people capacity. However, using the same approach, on the right-hand side, you could have 2 teaching stations that have 50 pupils on the one side, and then 1 teaching station for 25 pupils on the other. So in that situation, you would have 3 teaching stations for 75 people capacity under the new system. So a couple of things to consider if the subcommittee wishes to pursue this new system is, the first one is that basically we believe that the Department of Education would need to provide guidelines as far as what would be a teaching station and how the number of teaching stations are identified within a given area. Another consideration is that it may require that we review the same set of plans in terms of when they're approved from the Division of State Architect versus preliminary plans that get submitted to the Department of Education. Oftentimes, districts submit the plans to both agencies at the same time, and it may or may not result in the same plans that get approved by the Division of State Architect. We use those plans to award grants, which again may or may not be different than the initial submittal. And another consideration is this would require reestablishing eligibility to use this new system. So far, we've been using the 4 walls and door approach to establish eligibility for the districts that are coming into the program. We believe that this would require going back and reestablishing the eligibility for all those districts and using this new system. And it'd be difficult to sometimes match the square footage with teaching station, again, if areas that are less than 700 square feet per classroom. So there's a couple of, again, considerations for this option. I don't know, Madam Chair, if you want to go through all the options or stop at each one and answer questions or go through the rest of them.
All the options,
Okay.
I think that.
So option 2 is a little different. Instead of teaching stations, we look at the student classroom capacity. So it's a similar concept, but you look at the number of pupils housed versus the teaching station or the 4 walls and door concept. Again, this would require the Department of Education to determine what the student capacity for the project would be, and then the number of student capacity in the project would equate to the number of pupils housed and result in funding for new construction. A couple of considerations of this approach is basically we think that it would still require us to go back and reestablish eligibility under this new system. And if you go back, again, when districts establish eligibility, it's what's considered a snapshot in time. So a lot of districts establish eligibility early in the program, so it may be difficult to go back and determine what the capacity was at that time. Something to consider if we decide to explore this further. And again, we think that we may need to be looking at the same set of plans that have been approved by DSA to ensure consistency. The last option is to basically use a square footage based approach. So there would have to be a predetermined area per student. As an example, there could be 35 square feet per pupil. So when you take a look at the total area, this is in the middle of page 73, if you have 1,500 square feet, you divide that amount by the predetermined square feet, in this case it's 35, and that would equate to 43 pupils. And that is the amount of pupil grants that the district would be able to request for purposes of establishing grants for new construction. There could be also some checks in terms of making sure that the classrooms are less than 700 or not less than 700. We also think that there may be consideration for different types of students, in terms of the area per student. You may have to have a different amount for students such as special day class pupils or kindergarten students that may require a different area amount. Similar considerations as some of the other one. We think that this one may provide the most flexibility. There could be, you would still require to reestablish eligibility, and again, it would to account for the square footage at the time when they establish eligibility. And then the last option is basically no changes. If the subcommittee is interested in pursuing the same approach that we have now, option 4 would be basically to make no changes. So those are the options that we have for discussion. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, and before we start asking our questions, comments, is there any public comment on this? Come on up.
Right here?
Right there is perfect, yep. So as long as you speak into the mic there, it's great.
Well, Madam Chairperson, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Don Ulrich. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Facilities in Clovis Unified and a member of the CASH Board of Directors. Before I started facilities, I spent 25 years as in the education side as a teacher site administrator, and I spent 7 years as an intermediate and high school principal. And I want to tell you, Ms. Moore has done an excellent job advocating for flexibility. I think she understands that real well and is able to communicate the need for instructional spaces that could be smaller than a regular classroom, larger than a regular classroom, meet needs of intervention, meet needs for career technical education. Different types of instructional models is what we're advocating for. I want you to know that CASH supports this flexibility in designing classrooms. I don't believe there's any doubt that the education community supports flexibility in funding classrooms also. But we do want to recognize that the OPSC needs a way to adequately hold schools accountable for using state funds. And I was really glad to hear today that we're talking about options that will provide that flexibility. I think that's real important to know. And I want to offer that anybody from CASH, myself included, can work with OPSC to really come up with the guidelines that will support flexibility and balance that with the accountability that you're looking for. I believe that there's also an issue with educators. Moving teachers to a different mode of instruction, a different method of instruction than 1 to 30 or 35 is a difficult challenge. You talk to any educator that's tried to implement changes in instruction, that is challenging. And what I'm happy to see is that OPSC is looking at supporting that change rather than supporting a model that is still that 900 square foot box that limits the type of instruction that we want to do to offer our kids, our students, 21st century schools and 21st century learning. So if you have any questions of me, I'd be glad to answer them. And thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Sure, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to comment? Thank
Thanks.
you. So, Ms. Moore, do you have any comments or questions? Oh,
Always have some kind of question.
okay.
I just wrote down some notes when I was doing this. I like the fact it's flexible, but not just for the schools, but also for OPSC as administrators to look at these things. I think if you go one formula or the other, let's say the room's 1,200 square feet and you go for the square foot thing, but you really only going to put 25 students in there, it's probably not fair to the school. At the same time, we also want to kind of control our costs. So I was wondering how the formula fits into the reimbursement for the school construction. So if I design a place, like we were talking about your example earlier, for area that you may have like a open area of teaching stations versus walls, so that you do group activities as well as individual activities, and we fund that at a certain rate per student. And then later on, that does get converted into a wall type of structure, temporary inside. How does that get recalculated toward the number, does those type of things change? Because if you're looking at the 900 square feet versus a 1,500 square foot room, because maybe it's vocational ed part of it or something, how's it but you can only put 25 students in there. I mean, how's all this going to work? And what I want to do more than try to figure out this is the only black and white type of thing, you need guidelines. But I also like for the staff who's been trained on this to look at this, this makes sense, we want to see this happen. And if there's a problem between you and the school district, they come and present the case to all of us up here and say, this is why we want it configured this way, and we have a different calculation. At the same time, I want to protect the people's dollars and say, well, we can't afford to have these larger rooms if we're somehow funding it differently. So I just want those checks and balances, but give you the most flexibility. So I'm trying to figure out which option that is, really.
Right now, we don't address changes after funding. So all of these models assume the current system continues in terms of the state provides funding.
Per student.
Well, yes, and then after the apportionment, we don't go back currently and check to see if the configurations have changed.
What happens if they come back 5 years from now or 7 years from now, and we have on our records 6,432 seats, and they say, no, we only have 5,000 because we reconfigured. How do you address that?
The only thing that we check is that we check the classrooms. The classrooms in the plans that were funded, we may go back out and check to make sure that those classrooms are there, the physical spaces. Now, the districts may choose to use them differently. We don't check for that. We just check basically that the physical area was built as designed in the plans. That's the current practice now. We didn't address how that would work or if it would be different with any of these models. We didn't look at that from that perspective.
Go ahead.
I'm just curious, do you have any recent examples of a school whose plans ran into a problem because of our method of funding in regard to the type of school that they wanted to build?
Not that comes to mind. I think maybe some of the districts might have a better idea, but I know that there's been, in the past, there's been some questions about what we've identified as a classroom in the plans for purposes of funding versus what the district believes that it should be. And in those cases, there may be a difference in terms of what the Department of Ed identified as a classroom pursuant to their regulations. There's been a few cases that has come up, and the funding could be affected. It is affected because we look at the program and the regulations and award grants pursuant to our regs, which may or may not be different with what the district identified the classroom, the space as, or the Department of Ed. I don't have a specific example in mind right now, but I know that in the past.
So it doesn't happen too often?
I don't think so. I think if you look at
Well, there's a difference of opinion on that probably because we see it at the Department of Education, and we've had these. Page 15 is an example of one that was not able to be funded, and it was a school district that wanted to do their classrooms in small group individual learning areas, and it was not able to be funded through the program, which raised for me, along with some other examples, that it's not because OPSC didn't necessarily want to fund them, it's just some of the parameters of the program have prevented people from moving forward with other types of educational environments. A couple of points that I'll make on this, because it is the issue I brought forward, and it is one that I feel passionately about, and that is that we should not be precluding educational arrangements that school districts want to have. And I think there's two parts of that. One may be that some have tried it and weren't successful. I think, moreover, we have a system that says we fund 960, so that's what we get. If you have a system that says we fund flexibility, or we'll fund you however educationally you need in your area, that's a different kind of message, I think, to districts. And so systemically, I think that we have limited choice for education in terms of how we fund and for certain designs. So that's one component of it. And I think that we should be able to fund different alternatives. Now, the Department of Education, I actually believe, is in the best position to be able to determine what is appropriate educationally. I mean, that is our role, and that is our role in the system, in partnership with OPSC and DSA in bringing these projects forward to ensure that both they're accountable and that they're educationally adequate. So, you know, I think I would advocate for your solution, I think, number 2. Very appreciative of the solutions, because I think there is a solution out there that the board would feel, you know, nobody's willy-nilly just getting grants, and yet that school districts have the flexibility. 2 other points that I would make is I think that 2 things. We ought to be looking at the loading factor for schools was put into place at the time that the state had public policy around 20-1. We have a new public policy around local control funding formula that I think we ought to be thinking about in terms of what does that mean for the loading for schools. My understanding is it's 24-1, or what you may be under contract locally. And I think that the board needs to be in alignment with where education is moving on that issue. And then finally, I would say I don't necessarily agree that moving forward and looking back has to be the same parameters. I think the looking back can certainly be the kinds of schools that we have created and built to date, and their classic classroom configurations. And that can be a counting mechanism, if we want, so to speak, for an inventory. But looking forward, I certainly think that there can be different types of learning stations funded and accounted for. If you have to translate it to a classroom equivalency or something to that effect, it's very doable. But I don't see that we have to treat the past and the future the same, and would actually not advocate for that. I think we've done an inventory, and we probably will do a new one based on what we built in the past. And then finally, I want to make sure that this translates over also to modernization, that we aren't preventing the modernization of schools to reconstruct their learning space area by our viewpoint on what is a classroom or not. So again, providing for that flexibility that we need moving forward.
Can I just ask a couple of lame questions, I guess? First of all, when the Department of Education set the regulations of what's a classroom or not, so why would we be trying to redefine it? Why does education take the lead and say, we certify this as a classroom?
We would certainly welcome that.
I'm just wondering, does that, if we're paying per student, and we're only paying a certain fee, so it doesn't go up or down depending on the size of the room, depending on whatever the case may be. So if the state architect and you guys approve this is a classroom, it's not going to make a difference because we're still funding the same amount per pupil, correct?
That is correct. We have translated that per pupil amount back into a loaded classroom.
Okay, so if you kept the per pupil versus per classroom as far as funding, if you want to put, I'm thinking, my son's taking college classes. He's a senior in high school right now. He's taking a couple night classes. They have the bigger lecture halls now. Maybe
200 people in that room.
Yeah, and maybe they want a 200-person room just so they could combine classes that are more sustainable with that. And others, a lab, you may not have room more than 15 or 20 people in it. But as long as you guys determine that's the purpose for the room, we're still only paying per student.
That is correct. And where the issue comes is to capacity. So let's say, in your example, the capacity indicated is 200 students, so 200 students are funded. I think that when the program originally began in 1998, we had these grants. I think that school districts believed that they were going to be able to ask for the those grant amounts and then proceed to house their students. And it evolved from there into counting of classrooms to determine the capacity.
But you also have to count the classrooms to figure out how many you can house right now versus your eligibility, and that's how you get your difference. So I guess it's not so much how much more we're funding, but how do you start off with the number of classrooms you have right now. And that, again, goes back to, we're construction oriented here, but the Department of Education sets the standards of what is a classroom or what is a particular thing,
Well,
and they should be able to.
Can I get in my
Yeah.
2 cents here?
Sorry.
Because I think there are some important issues. If you're going to sit down, I'll call on you in a few minutes, thanks. Since we started our discussion here, but I think there, well, and I think anyone else behind you if they're trying to say anything. So I think there are some important issues here, and I'm not sure that they're not somewhat interrelated and we don't have to find some sort of a happy medium. One question I think that gets asked, is there a demand for alternative designs? And clearly, I think you could say any school district that wants to participate in the program probably knows the rules and will design around the rules. So we probably have some that, like you suggested, Ms. Moore, that aren't submitting because they know they don't qualify. Now, I don't necessarily see the demand as half the schools in this state want to change how they design schools. I mean, there are plenty of people who like a traditional classroom design. So I don't quite see that. But the question is, should we allow flexibility, and how are we going to allow that flexibility? I believe we should allow flexibility. You gave an example at a prior meeting where you might have a school that wants to have a, whatever that is, 3,840 square foot classroom, whatever it is, and combine 4 classrooms and have 4 teaching stations. I don't have a problem with them doing that. Whether I agree with it educationally or not, but I want to be able to count that as 4 teaching stations. I don't want to count that as 1 and then have you come back and say I want to add 3 more. So that's where I think the balance of the flexibility and accountability comes in terms of and maybe you can have a minimum of, if you divide, I divided on my calculator, 700 divided by 25 students comes out to 28 square foot per student. So I don't know the best way to implement that, but ultimately I think if we are then funding that for 100 students, it should count as 4 teaching stations, and we should have a way of counting that in our inventory that I think we're all agreeing that we need as 4 teaching stations, so that the taxpayers are funding 100 students, they know that they're getting 4 teaching stations out of that, and we have a match.
Great.
So
We're right there with you.
so the question becomes is how do we accomplish this in a way that's reasonable and efficient and allows for that level of accountability? I'm not sure we necessarily have the answer in any particular one option here, but maybe there's consensus around what we want to accomplish there, whether it's strictly, because there should be, certainly the Department of Ed can approve classrooms, but there's got to be some kind of coordination between the Department of Ed and our programs in terms of what we're counting and how we're funding. There's got to be some sort of level of agreement if we're going to administer this in an efficient way.
And to make sure that, and just to add on to that what's counted today, what we fund today, isn't recalculated in a different way later at the detriment of the taxpayer. So we fund 400 students today, and all of a sudden that 300-foot classroom
Right.
doesn't fit for them, and we make, even the state does legislation, you can't teach anything less than 900 square feet, and all those things don't count. I don't want to end up repaying for new classrooms.
No,
later
and
either. So
I think that school districts realize that, and I think in the program we've always pretty much, yes, the title changes. Probably we've had some differences in definitions, like in 1998 when 700 square feet under became not a classroom. We have those changes, but I think on the whole, what we're saying to school districts, I believe, is, okay, you've created capacity for 500 students. That's what you're charged. That's what it is forevermore. Those 500 students are considered housed. How you house them, whether you did in a double-loaded corridor or whether you did in a completely different-looking plan, is your educational need and prerogative. And I think districts are used to that. They're not going to then come back in and say, well, now I want more money. And that's why.
They would if they could, and I think.
Well,
and
I think if the rules are there that you
And-
know,
and I
that you
think-
know that your capacity was 500, it's 500
Well,
until.
but I think we need to be sure.
the life of the building.
However we design our regulations or
Yeah.
whatever, there is some kind of accountability there. I'm going to use your big classroom example.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's whatever it is, 3,000, what is it, 840?
It's on page 13. So.
Okay, well, whatever that is, I'm going to round out to, let's assume with typical classrooms, 1,000 square feet instead of 960, because that makes it easy, okay? And we have 4,000. I think you want to have some sort of accountability so that, you know, if you do want to divide it up, you can divide it up into reasonable classrooms, that you don't have a situation where you do end up with, as Senator Hagman says, you do end up with 300 square foot rooms that you can't use for anything later on. So I think you've got to have flexibility, but you've got to have some kind of reasonableness, and you've got to have some kind of way of holding a school district accountable now and in the future for that space. And I think the original intent of this program was to basically say, we're going to give you a grant, we're not going to tell you exactly what you have to do. So what we want to be sure is, if we're giving new construction dollars, that ultimately that money's being spent wisely. It's going to house students, and it's going to meet the need over time.
If I can follow up, right now we have these things in regs, so I probably won't have too many examples, but do you have examples of schools that have asked for recalculation when they come back based on prior design not working?
No, I don't have any examples.
Because we have so much
But we only,
structure in the plans as it
that's
is
right.
right now.
They have to build classrooms that are over 700 square feet now, so that you have
So
a
if
match.
you had it where the Department of Education approves a school for 700 students, and then you would get the plans, how would we structure our internal regs for you to say, yes, we agree with DOE, we're funded for 700 students, or no, we have a problem with this because of our thoughts of practicalness, or whatever the case may be from your experiences, and there's that check. So, you know, I don't think it's going to happen very often, because, again, what school is going to invest their own money in something that's not going to be practical for them as well?
Well-
But if there is that system where you both agree and you certify that minimum 700 students, so they can't come back and say it's really only 600 later, then next time they come up for modernization, they come up for new construction, whatever the case may be, the add-on, that 700 baseline is always going to be there.
I'm definitely open to checks and balances, but another component that I think we ought to think about is not duplicating efforts. And I think that I would hope we could get to a place where we don't have one agency checking another agency's work. I mean, and then are we going, you know, am I going to need to check Division of State Architects' work? So I think we ought to agree that each entity brings to the table their particular expertise, they're reasonable, they're accountable, and let the system work that way. I mean,
I think that the ideal would be to have conversation up front, so we have some agreement in terms of what we're going to allow, how we're going to determine it, and how we're going to count it.
Absolutely.
And there has to be some consistency there, because there's that coordination in terms of what are you going to build and how you're going to count it. And if we don't, if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing,
I agree.
We're just asking for
Well, that's where
problems down the
we've
road.
talked about that we, you know, Title V and OPSC's regs, we need to be consistent and be so that we don't send a mismatched message to
Right.
school districts. I think the other component that is involved in this is the school districts and their educational plan and their educational specification and what their community wants to achieve
Right.
from their modernization and new construction.
But we're just
projects.
talking, I'm going to give you an example that probably, I'm sure was true in Bill's district, and maybe many of the districts where the audience worked. You know, we had a time when we had the open classroom, you know, in our schools. And if you had a room like this, or a school, represented a school, you could see from one end to the other.
I don't
And-
think we're
and-
talking about the open classroom.
I'm not talking about the, I'm using this as an example to say what districts went in then did, and they started going in and adding partitions and building walls. But that open classroom design then was designed to hold a certain number of students. And my belief is, if we're going to approve alternative designs, and that's what the way the district wants to go because it believes it's the best educational program for its students. And I don't want to second guess, but I just want to be sure, and I think this piggybacks on what Senator Hagman's saying. I just want to be sure that if you go in and you want to change that design, that it's not on the state's dime. It's on, I mean, the district has made that decision, and we have to be sure that whatever you've designed there in terms of square footage counts for that number of students. And so, because if we're not, I agree that we shouldn't be dictating that, but again, you've got to balance that.
Sure.
What you're doing with how you count it and how you're, and what the accountability is, both at the time you're building it and going forward.
I'm convinced. I think we can easily get there
So-
to have a model that all parties buy into and agree is functional, that has the accountability and the flexibility.
And maybe what you do is set your baseline a little more conservative as far as the construction, but have a process, because 99% of the classrooms and things like that are going to be fitting that baseline model, but also have a process where they do want to do something more creative, that process articulated so they can come to you. and
Here's
say,
where
"We
I
want something
here's
different."
where I want to be. I don't want our policies to preclude people coming out of the gates from designing in a manner that maybe they need to be designing for 21st century learning. So whatever our policies are, they should be saying, if you are designing, for 21st century learning, if you're designing for a more traditional model, however you're designing, it's okay. We're going to fund you, but not to put the stops on to where you don't have anybody coming in with the exceptions and you continue to have only one model dominate our educational system, which may not work for all situations.
I think we're in agreement there in terms of how do we, we don't want to preclude other designs. We want to be sure that we are housing the number of students for which we're giving eligibility, and we have a way of counting that in a meaningful way. And if one district's 21st century design is different than another, and District A finds it's not working down the road, that District A has that responsibility. I mean, we're not going to pay for it to change. I mean, they're taking responsibility. They've got the freedom. They're also taking the responsibility for what they're building. So we have, we have all those elements in the plan.
Can I make a couple of comments? So as we get close to trying to come to a resolution, I heard Ms. Moore say that she liked option 2, and that is that, or CDE reviews the project and determines what the capacity is. And I think one thing we should look at is that option 3 is actually one way of doing that. There's probably other ways.
square footage.
The square footage of learning area per
Learning
pupil.
area.
That's one way that you would potentially use, and there's probably other ways. I don't know what they are, but to me, it seems like option 3 is really a subset kind of option 2. So they meld together, because that's probably one of the best ways to determine capacity is using the square feet of learning area, because you probably have metrics from other states and guidance from teacher organizations, that kind of stuff where you could.
Well, but there's nothing in option 3 that says you're going to have, how many teaching stations you're having per given set of students.
It's just about the capacity.
Right,
It's
and
the
so
student
and that's
capacity.
completely open-ended. So I think the question's got to be, the thing about option 2, which I think has appeal as well, is you're talking about teaching stations per students. And I don't know what the right answer is. Clearly, I think we can develop, I'm not sure we have to decide which the right answer is today, other than maybe have some agreement that we'd like flexibility, but we want to have accountability that we have the right number of teaching stations per student, and that we are holding districts accountable longer term to those teaching stations that we fund. So we're not funding them today and then having a different model tomorrow and funding them a second time.
And obviously support that and just indicate that, that is one of the roles of the Department of Education is to ensure that there's educational adequacy. So in partnership with OPSC in terms of the accountability, I think we can get there. And I want to see a role for that education is forefront in the role of ensuring that it's educationally adequate as well as financially sound.
Are there any more? You still
comments?
have is there any
Basic
comment you want to
concept.
make?
I think
Yeah.
we have agreement on a set of basic concepts. So
Right.
we can try and structure a consensus
Yeah.
recommendation out of it.
Yeah, I mean, my issue with 3 is I could go out and build a 50,000 square foot gym and just have cubicles for everything else. I mean, there's got to be.
And I think you would see
So-
the Department of Education have a problem
I
with
would
that.
think you would
So-
too, but that's
so-
why, that's
so,
why I'm saying.
there is,
I'm
I
not
think
saying-
there's
I'm not saying
reasonableness
you-
in all of
I'm
this.
not saying you would, but that's why I'm saying, to me, reasonableness is going to tie into
Yeah.
teaching.
And
have
we
to
do it
decide
every
right.
day
Not
already. I
completely
mean,
flexible.
we count the classrooms already in these programs, and then they come to OPSC and they get counted again. So
Right.
that's some repetition that
Right.
goes on.
Well, that's,
but
I wasn't bringing that up suggesting that you weren't responsible. I was bringing that up saying I think
I
that's
know
why
you
we need additional conversation so you figure out how it all fits together in a way that's both fiscally responsible, provides the flexibility, but also provides us with, the number of teaching stations to accommodate the kids. So do you still have a comment to make? All right.
Sorry about standing up. I should have raised my
Okay.
hand. As a school person, we follow rules usually. Joe Dixon, Assistant Superintendent and Santa Ana Unified and CAS Chair, and thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I stood up because I wanted to help Mr. Almanza with his question of examples in OPSC. Didn't have any. 3 years ago, we had a superintendent who was the assistant to Arnie Duncan in Washington, D.C., Assistant Secretary of Education, and she came in with some ideas for flexible learning spaces. We're very active in the Overcrowding Relief Grant Program, for example, and usually the examples I'm going to use is for secondary schools, but we're building a 40-classroom building to replace 40 portables. Now, per regulation, we have to have 40 classrooms or 40 teaching stations. Our superintendent, who'd been all over the country looking at best practices for education, said, geez, can't we make these flexible learning spaces? And the answer is no. By the ORG regulation, we replace 40 teaching stations, 40 classrooms with 40 classrooms. And when you get in all districts are different, right? Different sizes, different geography. We have 2,500 kids on 20 acres. It's a tight site. So it's not like we could expand the building. We're trying to free up green space. So we're stuck, if you will. It's very nice, and we appreciate the support from the state for the Overcrowding Relief Grant. Very nice classroom building, but it doesn't have the 21st century classroom model that we hope to build.
What do
We
you
couldn't
see
do
as that? What do you envision as the 21st century model?
Collaborative spaces, especially secondary schools for project-based learning, STEM academy type of things. For us, and what Dr. Melendez, who was our superintendent, talked about was a large learning space with smaller pull-out areas around it, and then they collaborate in that flexible learning space in the larger space for project-based learning. And if you go to certain charter schools in San Diego, I visited a lot, in LA I visited a lot, they've been utilizing that model very successfully.
Now, how would that look from a cost to the district as far as you put 3 sets of traditional 25-student classrooms, so you have 75 people utilizing the space around, or I'm trying to practically.
The same square footage could be utilized. The smaller pull-out rooms would be smaller than 960 or 900. So let's say it's a 2,000 square foot
So it sounds
flexible
like the
learning
square
space.
footage calculation per student would be roughly
The same.
workable too.
The same. And I support the flexibility. I just wanted to give an example, but we appreciate the flexibility that you're talking about.
So it stifled innovation, the current process. Your ability to innovate in
Right.
classroom design.
It stifles that, yes.
Well, I think their innovation is in how they're delivering the instructional program. They want the facility to support the instructional program that they're doing. I think in terms of some of what we've talked about, you're probably still, your student-teacher ratio on an overall basis, is, in terms of your number of teaching stations, is probably still staying the same. And so that's why I believe we can probably find a way, if we want to have the discussions, to meld both. There are going to be schools that are going to want still the traditional method. I mean,
Sure.
the standards, Common Core and all that doesn't change. And it may be in some communities or schools, they're going to deliver it one way, and others are going to deliver another way, depending on what the needs are. And what I'm hearing is you want flexibility to be able to adjust to the needs of your unique community and how you want to deliver that program. And so I don't think that's unreasonable. The question becomes is how do we, as was said by the first speaker, how do we tie that flexibility to the accountability? Because both have to go hand in hand in terms of how the state writes you dollars for your facilities.
Right.
And I'm not so sure if we didn't have a conversation that we couldn't find a way that allows us to maintain an inventory and count spaces in a way that, if we're giving you money for, if we kept the 25 to 1, and maybe it shouldn't be that because, as Ms. Moore points out, the new class size reduction is only funded at 24 to 1, not 25 to 1. But if we were to count the 25 to 1 and we gave you money for 100 students, we're expecting you to have the equivalent of 4 teaching stations. How you design those may be up to you, but how we count them has to be a way that is reasonable and makes sense as well.
Yeah, we support that, and we appreciate that, or I
Yeah.
do. Even within our community, there could be schools that are traditional, let's say, and other ones with flexible learning spaces.
That's right, and
Right.
yeah, but we just want to ultimately be sure that,
Right.
whatever we have is reasonable and
Yep.
can meet our demands.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we somewhat are in consensus here, right?
I think we have the basis of consensus.
Right.
And I think that we could work with that.
Right.
Building on the principles that you indicated, flexibility, accountability, a role for the Department of Education, in determining educational adequacy and ensuring that we are, the Department of Ed, the Office of Public School Construction, and frankly, the Division of State Architects
So can
are
I
in
add,
sync.
and can I add one word, flexibility, accountability, and I'm going to add consistency. We want to be sure that we have consistency between Department of Ed and OPSC in terms of how we count
Absolutely.
and how we
Yeah.
allocate.
I'm good.
So we'll hopefully then bring that back. We're not going to have all the answers in all of this, but we'll bring that back when we
Bill, figure it out.
I thought the staff did a fabulous job of summarizing
Yeah. No,
and putting forward possible solutions.
Yeah, well, and we've talked before. These are all
Step
big
4.
issues, and I think it's healthy that we have all these conversations, and we don't necessarily have to have all of the answers initially. So now we're going to discuss options for the school facility programs.
So our next topic is the Modernization Program, and this
Right.
was a discussion that was requested to be brought back for ways that we might make potential changes to the Modernization Program. And as we were preparing this report, the way we looked at it was that it may actually be 2 separate questions. One would be a way of looking at potential changes to how you generate modernization eligibility. And then going hand in hand with that, but a slightly different process, might be how we look at providing modernization funding. And this was in response to concerns that the current funding model didn't take into account things such as the condition of the facilities. For example, a 40-year-old building might be in great condition because of its type of construction or the district's level of maintenance, whereas you might have a 10-year-old facility that needs modernization now, even though the current program wouldn't see that building for a number of years. And then there were some other points brought up related to campuses that had facilities that had different ages and how that can be difficult to do a complete modernization project. And then also that the current system may not provide sufficient funding to do educational modernization as well as just modernization of the facilities themselves. So just as a brief reminder, the current eligibility program is age-based for the facilities, and it uses a pupil grant model based on the enrollment at the site, the capacity at the site. So we're looking at modernizing buildings that are of permanent construction at 25 years and portable facilities at 20 years, and then that's further limited potentially by the number of students that are enrolled at the site at the time the eligibility is determined or updated. So in looking at ways to approach this, we came up with two options for eligibility models, and one could be a condition-based model, and then the alternative might be an age-based model with some potential modifications to things we look at today, such as enrollment at the site, et cetera. And then the funding models, we have listed three, one using a cost estimate, one looking at square footage for funding, and then also looking at the current model of per pupil. So on page 18, we start with the modernization eligibility models, and the first one that we have listed is an option to determine the eligibility for the buildings based on the condition of the facilities. And this, under this site, it takes age completely out of the factor of modernization eligibility, and school districts or other entities would perform an assessment of the facilities on the site and rate the condition of the buildings and identify the work that was necessary. And this rating system would then correspond in some way to dollars available for the school site. And the board could establish different types of rating criteria. We've listed a couple examples. Could be a numerical index that assigns a building a score, and that there's a tool out there called the Facilities Condition Index that could be used. And then also we have an example of an assessment program with the facility inspection tool that was used in combination with the emergency repair program, and that is a more simple ranking where it gives buildings just an identifier of fair, good, poor, and then those broader categories could be connected to funding amounts. Now, those are not the only methods you could use to rank buildings. There could be many variations of that, but those are two of the main categories that we were looking at there. Now, with this, buildings are going to have different level of need, and there may not be unlimited dollars, so it would be necessary to consider potentially how to prioritize or potentially cap eligibility at the site, because there may not be enough funding to cover all of the needs that are identified by the assessment of the facilities. And then the other thing to point out is that while this system, it could completely eliminate the age requirement, it may be worthwhile to consider whether the board would then want to think about age so that we're not putting modernization dollars into a building that just received new construction funding 5-10 years ago. That may not be something that folks are interested in doing. So that is something that could be put into place where the main driver would be the condition of the building with some parameters around it. And then, so the other thing would be when a district could update its eligibility. If you move away from an age-based concept, then you lose the every 20 years or 25 years. You can come in again, get additional modernization dollars. So there would need to be something set forward. If I modernize today based on the condition of my facilities, when can I touch this building again with state funds? So that would need to be something else that was considered there. This system would require both regulatory and changes in statute. And it's one of the methods that we were putting out there for consideration. And would you like me to go through the other?
Yeah, go through all of them, and we'll take comments, and then we'll go to member discussion here.
Okay. So the other method that we have here is to continue to determine the eligibility based on the age of the facilities, but take a look at some of the issues that might be limiting flexibility in the modernization program with the way this program is designed today. And one of those things may be looking at sites as a whole versus partial site eligibility. So if you have a site where half the buildings are brand new and half the buildings were built 50 years ago, it makes it more complicated to do projects. So one of the things we put out there was that maybe there was a threshold for when the entire site would become eligible for modernization. And you could set that at varying numbers, but maybe 70% of the site needs to be of a certain age, and then the entire site could get funding to be modernized. And then all of the buildings would receive potentially a new date on that. So there would still be a minimum age, but it would not be building by building or classroom by classroom, but it would look more at the site in totality and then set some parameter where we're going to reach 60%, 70%, 80% of the site, and then you can do the whole site. And then the other thing we considered was removing the pupil grant cap, because right now if you have a school that was originally built for 500 pupils, it's all of age. When you come in to modernize, if you only have 350 pupils at the site, then the program limits the eligibility that you can request at that 350 pupil grants, which there's comments have been made that just because the kids aren't there doesn't mean that the facilities are then less expensive to modernize or that they don't need modernization. So you could lift the pupil grant cap and base modernization eligibility on the original capacity of the site, so that the modernization dollars are tied to the facilities rather than the students that are currently enrolled at the site. And on page 21, we've listed some considerations for continuing the age-based models with the changes to the partial site and the enrollment issues. And just things to consider is that this doesn't make a distinction to the condition of the facilities. And it could increase the demand for modernization bond authority because you're potentially modernizing buildings earlier than would be anticipated. And it does, these changes would potentially result in the districts receiving more funding under the new method than they would under the program as it's established today. So those are the two main eligibility concepts that we had set out there.
Are there any comments? Come on up.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because there's some other folks that want to speak as well. You know, modernization is so complex. I don't think today there's enough time to really fully vet some of the issues. I would ask respectfully that a whole subcommittee meeting be devoted to modernization. I can give you a lot of different examples. What I passed out right now is just one example. In Santa Ana, we have again, a really small site. The playground's on the roof. We spent more of our money modernizing that school, but we weren't able to complete all the DSA required fire and life safety items. In fact, I have a meeting October 1st with San Diego DSA to go over what am I going to do. We did want to finish it. We replaced the roof. It's a concrete roof. Again, the playground's on the roof, so it was real expensive. And we had an emergency repair program. We're on the list, the unfunded list for that, so we anticipated getting that funding, but we haven't. The state hasn't funded that for 3 years, 4 years. So we're stuck. We're stuck, and we weren't able to complete the modernization. And we're already $2 million over. We're double what we should have spent. So anyway, I would just request that perhaps a full subcommittee meeting on modernization take place. Thank you.
Any other comments on it?
Morning, Madam Chair. Afternoon, Madam Chair, Assembly, Subcommittee. My name is Tim White, Associate Superintendent from Oakland Unified, and I will be brief as well. I'd like to request, as Joe Dixon did, that actually a matter like this requires a deep dive, much deeper dive. I think what we have just heard presented by staff are some great options for us. I am concerned about things associated with the modernization as we have discussions about redefining classrooms and having the ability to give districts flexibility in how we actually design and teach our classrooms and the spaces that we want to teach our kids in, particularly in urban environments where our stock is primarily age stock. In some cases, buildings are 100 years old. And obviously, the limitations of flexibility associated with those are severe, and folks who actually have new construction grants don't have those kind of restrictions in terms of determining what future spaces should look like to be configured for our kids to be educated in. And so I think the classroom definition does coincide with modernization, and it clashes and restricts a large portion of the whole state from creating spaces that are educationally sufficient. And so as we start looking at funding models associated with that, I think we do need to look at educational sufficiency, and I did hear Director Moore mention that as well, because we can modernize schools and actually get them up to code, but if schools don't actually create environments where you can educate kids, then what good is having a code-compliant facility to begin with? And so educational sufficiency has got to be included, in whether or not that project's a modernization project or a new construction project. Our whole goal in these facilities is to make sure that kids get an equal opportunity for education. And so you have to consider what's happening on the curriculum side with the Common Core, with the local control funding formula, smarter balanced assessments, and we need to be ready in urban environments with old stock as well as new facilities in non-urban environments. And so I do believe some consideration and flexibility should be given to urban environments or environments that have old stock, so that at a certain point maybe it's feasible for us to demolish old facilities and replace them with new facilities, similar to what Bill Savage had set a model for in the district that he came from. I would like my district to have the same thing.
My district did the same thing, even though it's a suburban district, and it just meant that obviously that more
Did fewer schools.
responsibility. That's right, more responsibility fell on the district.
Good afternoon, Kathy Allen, Assistant Soup, Sac City Unified School District. As my colleague, Mr. White, appropriately called them aging stock or old stock, I think. I have 86 schools. Most of them are old, and a lot of them have a lot of challenges, obviously. So one of my concerns, and I definitely want to echo what has been said, that I do think a separate discussion would be wonderful to have, and I think it would be a great opportunity to allow us to bring forth to you very specific examples of maybe why an option would work better or might not work better. Or what are some of the constraints that we found when we were working under the current program, and what were we maybe not able to do, what were we able to do. I'm a little cognizant of using the condition of the facility as a method, and ironically this almost kind of leans more towards the state's funding side. You know, a lot of us have had our general fund maintenance budgets devastated, obviously, and I understand it's all about local control, but some of us are not able to adequately maintain our facilities to the degree that we should be able to, and so
You know any districts that are? I don't think it's some of us. I don't think
Most
that
of us,
it's.
okay.
I don't think it's ever been. I don't think the amount that the state's provided. I don't care whether you're urban, suburban, a relatively new district, an old district. I don't know any district that has had adequate funding from the state to maintain its facilities. So I don't think we ought to. It's a card that applies to everybody across the state.
Well, and the frustrating side of that for everybody is that, you know, instead of being able to put some regular routine maintenance money into, you know, keeping an HVAC system up and running for its expected life, we don't. We let it fail, and then, oh, guess what? We can use bond money to replace it if we're fortunate to have a bond. So the condition of a facility, I think, would have to really kind of dig into that a little bit deeper. But I think there's enough of us out here, you know, and the cash membership and other districts as well, just would be very happy to provide good living examples of what did work, what didn't work, and maybe take a look at some of the options that are presented to see what would help.
Question, Kathy. I am really interested in the condition. aspect of the proposal, and also it aligns with work that we've already done and that was done through the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools as well in their report. So I'm curious a little bit more, and maybe if you're not ready here today, but in the future, about what is the reticence around that issue where you said, I'm a little concerned about condition or being judged on condition. Is that the issue, or what?
No, actually,
funding on condition?
I would hate to see folks let their schools get so bad that they now become eligible for modernization dollars when maybe they could have used bond dollars to fix things or replace things. I mean,
If we put in place a bond bill next year, though, they have 1 year to let their facility go to shot. So I agree we should not have public policy that inadvertently encourages bad behavior. On the other hand, to me, we've had a policy that's been disconnected from what is actually happening at a site. And I applaud the staff for bringing forward some options and some investigation of that very issue.
I think the age, along with the condition, obviously has some, two huge factors in anything, whether it's the life cycle of a roof or an HVAC system or the amount of ADA requirements that are necessary to be done. So I mean, there's a lot of big ticket type of considerations. Anyway.
Are there any other comments? I think we all have, we can engage in a discussion and then not have you, I'd rather hear everyone's comments first and then we'll.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Orr, the Executive Director of the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, or CHIPS. Thank you for the opportunity to talk briefly. I'd like to highlight 3 things. The first one is, Kathleen just mentioned a minute ago that there have been several initiatives, several reports generated over the last couple of years. One of them was a Schools of the Future initiative that was initiated shortly after Tom Torlakson took office, and then the report that Kathleen just mentioned. And I think there's a lot of great information in both of those documents that could really lend to a broader discussion about how to approach modernizations. And so I would definitely support basically pulling together a meeting to just look at modernizations. The other thing I wanted to do was just briefly mention 2 other ways that school facilities, existing school facilities, have been assessed that are related to CHIPS. The first one is called the Operations Report Card, which is a benchmarking and improvement tool for existing schools. And rather than look at the condition of building systems like a facility condition index would, it actually looks at the learning environment. So it focuses on indoor air quality, acoustics, lighting, thermal comfort, energy efficiency, water conservation, and you basically come up with a score based on that. So instead of just looking at whether or not the roof needs to be repaired, you're actually looking at, are the levels of lighting in the classroom appropriate for learning, and the same on all of the other attributes. So that's just another, it's very complementary to a facility condition assessment, but it really looks at whether or not the bones are good for the classroom from a learning perspective. The other thing I wanted to just mention is actually, it was very ironic. Sac City did a master plan looking at the condition of their schools, and what they actually did was they used the CHIPS criteria as a method to go through and assess the condition of all of the schools in the district. And really driving that was, if they could improve the attendance in the district by 1%, what additional ADA would that bring to the table? So in addition to sort of the construction funding side, it's also looking at it from a systems perspective. And I think that's really what we need to look at, because the disincentives for, based on need to get more dollars, you basically have to look at that whole puzzle. So just in summary, I would support having a separate meeting just to look at modernizations, to look at the degree of need, and then also to look at some other assessment tools that might be relevant.
I'll give you my 2 cents on all of this. Is there anyone else who wants to speak before we?
Quick question.
Well, we're on this topic right now, modernization.
We had some funding thoughts too. Did you want us to briefly highlight those, or because we'd just gone through the eligibility piece?
Well, you talked a little, so, yeah, go ahead. I thought we had covered them in terms of
It's
how you might
somewhat
fund them on
similar,
different
but yeah,
areas, so go ahead.
Determining eligibility and then some ways to fund them, and I'll keep it brief since I know we've already heard some
Okay.
comments. But on page 22, we get into the funding models, and there's 3 we've proposed, the third one being keep it based on a pupil grant method.
Right.
But some of the thoughts we had were, and the funding models we were thinking could be used with either method of eligibility, whether you determine it based on a conditions assessment or whether it's an
Right.
age-based. But once you've determined the eligibility, under Model 1, you would use a cost estimate to determine the cost for the site.
Right.
And that would work with both the conditions-based assessment and the age-based assessment. But that cost estimate would either determine your cap for the site, or you could do potentially small projects based off of it and just kind of go up to that grant amount. Use of a cost estimate, some of the considerations, that is potentially going to increase processing time for districts and staff, as we would need to do potentially a more detailed review of the cost estimate. So that's one of the considerations. Districts may be able to request smaller projects than are currently under the program because it would be based on actual costs. So that might provide some more flexibility. And then the other thing to point out on that model is that we do currently have programs that use a cost estimate in the school facility program. However, all of those programs are based on a minimum work necessary type of concept. So this would be a potential departure from that and looking
Yes.
at just general cost estimates. And then page 23, the second model, the other thing we had contemplated was funding on a square foot grant amount as opposed to a pupil grant amount, and that the board would need to establish what the appropriate square foot grant amount would be. And right now, in other programs, we have toilet and non-toilet, just very general categories. So that might need to be different for modernization, given different building types, different types of work, et cetera. So that number would need to be established, but that could then be used to provide the dollars. And again, you can use that with the age-based model. You can use that with a condition-based model where you're providing the appropriate square footage dollar amount there. And then the third option was just the basic, use the pupil grant model for funding, and then consider if you need any changes to how that funding model is working. But I just wanted to point those out.
Okay. Go ahead. I'll add my comments
Okay.
after.
Well, this section, I'm sure we could do a few days in this, but these are some of my thoughts and concerns. And I always have to play devil's advocate. Okay, so I'm always going to talk like everyone's trying to take advantage or do something the wrong thing. But I think it has to be age-based. There's no way that we should kick in a 10-year building when we're still paying 30-year bond money on it. So you have to have some kind of age basis on there. Two, when I brought up the idea of having a database with conditions and usage of buildings, I had every school district tell me no, 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 no. But at the same time, they want the state to be the warranty operator for all these buildings. You can't have it both ways. If you aren't going to share what conditions your buildings are in and how we can use them, I don't think, frankly, we should be on the hook to replace them or fix them. So I think that has to be there. If we're going to be investing 30-year bond money into a new building, I think there's also have to be some sort of local stakeholder into keeping that maintained. If you don't, then I think we should not reward those. If you go condition-based, I don't think we should reward those who don't take care of their buildings. And just because some districts negotiate different contracts with their personnel over others, they have more money for maintenance, that is part of the local funding. If you decide to pay all your money in operations and no money for maintenance, you know the ADA has gone down, that some districts are going to put money away for maintenance, some districts are not, and we shouldn't reward those who don't do that maintenance in there. So I don't think it should be based on condition. It should be based on some sort of age. And I'm trying to think of some of my home warranties when I built my house and stuff. The roof's supposed to last 10 years. For the last 8 years, I get 20% of the money toward it or something like that, where it's supposed to have some longevity based on routine maintenance of that facility. And I think you could maybe make some kind of scaling of this building's supposed to last for 35 years, and we're 15 years into it. We'll give you so much of the warranty, you have to cover the rest. A percentage of scale based on longevity of expected longevity, I think, is the best ways to go on age base. I'm concerned about removing the cap. It totally makes sense to redo a whole facility if you're going to do it, but I also want to make sure there's not games played with that. If I have a school that's 1,200 pupils that has the capacity, and I have 1,200 students there, and I divide them up in 3 campuses that are vacant, I have 300 each one, and I got modernization of all 3 of those, and 2 years later, I transfer all back to one school for operational purposes and lease out 2 schools, then where's my money going to go for not providing for the students, but it's there to make money for the district? I had one of our speakers who just had a lot of their schools just put on the market for leasing this year, and I know that we put money in the last 10 years. And we got to make sure that that does not happen either. So it totally makes sense to redo a school, but at the same time, I want to make sure it's used for the students and not used for outside venture later on. And I'll turn it over to you.
Do you want me to go? Do you want to go? I have a problem with condition as well, because, well, for a number of reasons. One is that assumes the state's going to have some kind of standards, and I think we have a program that basically says, you know, local, and we've had for years, before Prop 13, I mean, local school boards were responsible for the construction and the maintenance of their schools. They design them, they're responsible for all of that, and it's never truly been a responsibility of the state. The state program has been designed to provide grants to help partner with school districts, to provide an incentive for local communities to pass bonds. But essentially, the state has never really been in that business. And I don't know how the state can get into that business for 1,000 districts or 10,000 schools. I do believe that every school district is part of their own facilities analysis. I mean, I know my district did, I'm sure Bill's district did, should be doing its own condition assessment. You know, when you decide, you know, when you're going to pass a bond or spend your developer fees or whatever, apply for money, you should have done that work locally to determine what conditions your schools are in, what your standards are, and how you're going to allocate the funds that you spend. So I think that's a responsibility for local school boards. I don't see how the state can get into that business, and I don't want to provide disincentives to build high-quality schools at the very beginning. Right now, if you know that your school can be modernized in 25 years, you should be designing a school that's going to basically last that 25 years, and not one where we come in after 5 or 10 years and we're looking at modernizing. Because I don't know how we can, at the state level, sustain that kind of financing. I do think we're talking in many respects about 2 different issues. One issue is how do we provide money for modernization? The other issue is how do we have those maintenance dollars so that we maximize the life cycle of our facilities? And that is a problem, and it always has been a problem. I know all of you are in facilities, so your job is to make sure you have the money to fix them, and the school board and the superintendent are also looking at the instructional side, and some of them will commit more money than others to the maintenance side. But even if you went back to when, you know, in the near past where we've had more money for maintenance, that was still not enough. I mean, when I take a look at what we paid to build the most recent high school in our school district, if you just put 1% aside, you'd be putting about $1.3 million a year aside for maintenance of that one school. Well, then you add in the other high schools, the middle schools, and the elementaries, you'd probably have to commit 20 to 30% of your budget to maintain them in the way all of us would want. And I don't think that's possible when you're funded 49th in the nation. And that's why I think we may need to take a look at how we fund major maintenance in a different way outside of the bond program. I mean, I've said to people I personally would love to see, it may not be politically feasible, but the ability of districts to pass parcel taxes strictly for facility maintenance at a 55% threshold, and allow communities then to invest in maintaining the bigger investment that they've made in facilities. But I don't think we're going to solve that problem through the modernization program. So where I have sympathy, and I don't know exactly how to do it, is that very rarely are you going to have a school district, and I'm not sure there's one in the state of California, where every school is housing its capacity. You know, in fact, I think ideally in your schools, you probably need to be at 90 or 95% of capacity, because then when a house turns over and someone moves in, that kid can go to the neighborhood school. Kids just don't come in those kind of bundles where you can get 30 kids in every classroom. So chances are, say you have a school with a capacity of 600, you know, you're probably going to be at capacity pretty much if you have 550 students. You might have space, you know, you might be one student short in each classroom or two, but you're utilizing all the classrooms. And so it makes sense then to me to fund the modernization of the entire school, you know, based on the 600 student capacity and not based on the 550 students. Now, if I have a school that was built in 2 phases, and one is 25 or 30 years old and the other is 10 years old, then I think you pretty much have to modernize in 2 phases, because I don't think we are going to want to modernize buildings that were just built 10 years ago. There might be some wiggle room depending on if we could come up with 90% of the buildings or whatever, but I do think, you know, age makes sense, and we want to incentivize people to build or modernize based on that cycle. I do think there should be flexibility. I don't know what you do if the state is supposed to have full responsibility for it because you decide a school isn't educationally adequate. We give you new construction grants instead of modernization grants. Because the way school districts are doing this now in the state is they're taking their modernization money, which at one point in time, all of you know, you weren't able to use modernization money towards tearing down and new construction, but they're taking that modernization money and putting that towards replacement if that's what the district feels like it needs to do. But, you know, and when I say all this, I say it all in the framework where all of you know that the governor is looking for a simple, streamlined, cost-effective program, you know, if we're able to get him to agree that we need a new bond, because I think all of us in this room agree that we need a bond. I don't think we're looking at expanding greatly. I think we're looking at how do we, you know, maximize value.
As I indicated, I mean, I think we looked at this extensively and asked for policy considerations around this with the Center for Cities and Schools report. And one of the pieces is this issue of condition, I think, as one point, and of equity probably as a greater point. And that maybe there's a place, because I do hear my fellow board members on the age piece, and I would agree with you that I don't think that we just, any age, any condition come in the door. But there perhaps is a combination between age and condition. And I think actually part of what you were expressing is capital renewals. I mean, the building industry, in which we are a part of, we're education, but we are also, in our capacity, part of a building industry. And that building industry has standards, and those standards are, you know, between 2 and 4% of the replacement value is invested back in the building every annually. We're not there. We're not there with maintenance. We're not there with routine maintenance, nor deferred maintenance, nor with modernization. But perhaps maybe that is where we can achieve to be. Where I've seen the disconnect is we say per pupil, which really is simply putting a capacity, putting a cap on what the state's willing to invest, because that per pupil doesn't really translate in the modernization world to what the particular situation is, where the systems are, what is the educational adequacy. It never translated there. It simply was about, well, this is what the state can afford. You bring forward, school districts, what you can afford, and you can do you then do your project. And I'm not so sure that's the best way. And we also have moved away, again, from square footage, which the rest of the building industry associates with. They modernize, they build, everything is computed on a square footage basis, not on the people that are in the building, but how big is the building and what is its condition. And I just think we've been a little disconnected from that, and I think that there is a need to greater emphasize what is this particular circumstance and condition of these buildings. Again, I agree we should not be incentivizing, bad or not investing in the buildings all along. I think there's a way that you could actually account for and give priority to those that have invested, and therefore you then begin that policy overview and incentive to invest in your buildings. If we somehow account for that in how we fund it. This program used to have a 3% requirement that you then had your 3% maintenance if you agreed to take state funds. That went away with flexibility and continues to be.
But even that 3% wasn't necessarily major maintenance. So it was not adequate to do the type of maintenance we really want, what you're really talking about. I mean, we call it deferred maintenance. It shouldn't be called deferred maintenance. It should be, because you have ongoing routine maintenance. Districts probably do even now spend pretty much close to that 3% on it. Then you have major maintenance, and that's where you build a building to last 25 years, but the HVAC system we know doesn't last 25 years. We know that every so many years you're going to have to paint that building, whether it's wood or stucco. If you don't paint it, you don't have that protective coating on the outside, and you either get leaks or you get dry rot. We know you've got to replace carpeting. We know that the ballasts go on the lights, out on the lights, and you've got to replace those. So there are certain things that you know you've got to do in the interim, and it's that type of major maintenance that, again, we call deferred maintenance, but it's that kind of major maintenance where there really is no funding for it in California, because when you're 49th in your basic per pupil spending to run your basic program and pay your utilities and all your routine kind of maintenance things, when you're 49th there, and then when you have a state program that's really designed to help provide capacity and for new construction and major, the renovation that you're doing, you've got that interim in terms of how do you fund that type of major maintenance. And that, I think, it is almost where you've got to have a crusade or a campaign to explain to, taxpayers associations and others that actually we could save tax dollars over time if we had a way to fund those kinds of projects. And I think to sell them on it, that money has got to be dedicated and do the kind of major maintenance it's intended to do and not divert it into other areas.
I 100% agree with you on maintenance, and I hope that as the bond measure moves forward, that there's hand in glove around that issue as well, because I think we all want to ensure that the assets that both the state and the locals invest in stand the test of time and are able and are functioning well into the future for all of us. So I'm 100% there with you, and as I said, I hope we have future discussions on that. Where I may depart from other members of this committee is that I do think that condition does have a place. There's a number of other states that use condition as part of their maintenance and as part of their modernization programs, and I mean the federal government, in terms of when they looking at base schools, it was based on condition. Maybe we don't have that tradition, and we don't want to upset the tradition that we have, but I think that if we were to marry that what locals do, and I think locals do look at condition, because that's how they're looking at their master planning, that's how they're looking at how they're going to invest their funding. What if the state was more simpatico with that? What if we had some of our requirements around that? So, and then if we want to cap the funds, you cap the funds, but that you're working in concert with what is best practice. Best practice is looking at condition and ensuring that your systems are working over time, let alone, again, my passion is educational modernization. I know that it's hard to fund, but some of these schools need to be reconfigured for 21st century learning. and we should first of all allow for that in terms of how we look at the plans. But secondarily,
We do allow, and if a school's over 50 years old, we provide more funding. If the replacement cost
I'm not so
exceeds a
sure
certain
we allow.
percent, we do that. We do allow. It's just that we don't allow. We don't
allow,
increase
I'm not sure that
don't
we
increase
allow
our time.
if I have 3 classrooms and I want to open that up and help me out, Juan, if we do, I stand corrected. If we have 3 classrooms, we want to open that up and maybe have a couple of small learning environments and a larger, and it counts to it only looks like 2. Do we allow that to happen?
There could be adjustments for capacity in terms of modernization.
Right.
The program right now doesn't allow for certain displacement of classrooms.
Displacement.
Right. But that's an eligibility issue that we can solve, just as we were
Great.
talking about the new
Love to solve
constraint.
that.
I mean, the bigger problem in terms of what we allow or don't allow is you design a school that 20 years from now someone says, who on earth designed that school? We've had, you're smiling because we've had that, And we had most of a high school we took down that was this horrible concrete structure, and it's like, what were they thinking? And so the question, but now you're on the school board, or you own it, Whoever made that decision, they made that decision, and the current people own it. And so the question becomes, if I approved a design of a school 20 or 25 years ago, and I decide I don't like it because I want to build a different one, should the state be responsible for replacing that, or should the district be responsible?
Well,
Because
I mean, let's talk a
opening
little bit about 50 and 75-year-old schools. The school that my grandmother went to, that we expect our children to be as comfortable and in the same learning environment for a completely different educational model. So I think that there are times that the educational model must change, and it's not a mistake. It wasn't a mistake when it was built.
My point is, if you've got a 50 or 100-year-old school and the cost to bring that up exceeds a certain amount, we allow for replacement of that school. So, there may be some way we can tweak that, but you've got to have your arms around it in some way, so that you're not just, replacing schools that we designed them, and now we don't like the design because we want to change the educational program and we want money to replace it instead of money to modernize it. There's got to be some way you balance that.
And I agree that there should always be balance, but I also believe that there should be flexibility for modernization to address educational needs. I don't think we get there today because of our funding cap. It's just, what we can afford to do in modernization, and probably Joe Dixon talked about it. He's already over his budget. He's talking about access requirements and systems replacement. That's probably what our modernization funds do right now. In my dream world, we would also be addressing educational modernization. And I don't think we should leave it off the table simply because it's not affordable. It should be part of the options that school districts have. And
I just want to tag on a little bit. If you do some kind of condition base, there's got to be some kind of, this is a partnership between the district and the state. When you bring up examples like the federal government, there is no partner with the federal government. They are themselves. So if one budget year they don't fund it, then they're still responsible for it. They're not waiting for their partner to do their part of that. And if you're going to have any kind of condition base, it's got to be accompanied with standard expectations of maintenance that you give as the other partner. And if they're not met, you don't qualify. And I think you have to have both. And I think that's,
maintain your car, the
warranty goes out.
voided.
Exactly.
I agree, and I think that we used to have a system where we said, and we're now in this flex world, so we need to adjust and figure out how it works, that we said we give funding 3% maintenance. There was that partnership. So now we're in a different world. How do we accomplish that and not incentivize, as someone pointed out, not to maintain the building?
And this is kind of hard because we gave the flexibility to the local districts to, now since we are bringing up the ADA somewhat, and I've noticed in my own district, the first people that got reimbursed were the people we let go, staff, personnel, all the stuff besides maintenance or new equipment. And it always goes to operations. So we have that constant battle of staff putting pressure on for pay wages and stuff, and we may be funded at the 49th level, but our staff gets paid the number one out of the rest of the states as well. So between both dynamics, there is nothing left for maintenance. And I don't know if we should have a position for that or not. That's the state.
I think condition-based could have a place when there's a scarcity of funds. Up until now, I think for the most part, age-based has worked because the projects get in line and the monies are made available as they are available. We have a waiting list now. We have a backlog. But it's worked. There's been enough funding. Going forward, maybe condition-based may have to be a part of the formula because of the scarce funding, because a building may have to be at least 25 years old and in really bad shape and to go to the front of the line. And that's what the federal model, I think, was based on. They use condition because they do have scarce funds. And there's only so many dollars that were available in the nation, and you had 5,000 projects, but you could only fund 100 of them. So they had to evaluate them and rank them based on condition. So if we find ourselves in that situation, then it may have to be 30 years old and in really bad shape. Hopefully not, but it depends on funding.
A couple of other things, if I could. One of the things in terms of what Assemblymember Buchanan said was about modernization as an incentive for districts to pass local bonds, and I think it actually is somewhat, pertains to the comments that Mr. Almanza just made about what kind of an era we may be entering into going forward in terms of how much ability the state is going to have to be a major partner in modernization. So maybe we think about what are the things that we want to incentivize. So one example of something I think we've talked about in the past, we want to incentivize when a district has portables that need modernization, we want to incentivize replacing those portables, right? I think I've heard that loud and clear from everyone here. So maybe there's a way that you use that as a piece. When we have really old buildings that are also in very poor condition, we want to incentivize replacing them. So maybe we incentivize that, we partner with districts, and that brings in, when you build a new building, it really enhances the educational adequacy, so it meets some of the goals that I think Ms. Moore was talking about too. Anyway, something to think about is, I really do, unfortunately, think, and maybe some of my friends, behind me won't agree, but I think we're entering into an age when we're not going to have the funding levels that we've had in the past, and we need to find ways to prioritize and incentivize, and that's hopefully some of the things we're talking about today.
I definitely agree on both those points. I'm not so sure that the modernization eligibility actually went to modernizing those buildings. I think sometimes it went elsewhere, but I think they have their useful life, and I'm concerned about putting more modernization dollars into 20-year-old portable buildings. And secondarily, I do think that I wouldn't want to be putting good money after bad in terms of keeping the shutters on a building when we should really, like the industry does, when they are beyond their useful life, they tear them down and they begin again. Hard to do in historic or one high school towns, but sometimes it's a better expenditure of funds if we can make that happen.
I think we have some consensus. It's hard. The whole hard part, and I think Bill, because I think he said it correct. Everyone. I do believe that we're not going to have. I don't know what. If we're fortunate enough to get a bond to the ballot, it's not going to be what we've had in the past, which means we're going to have to prioritize. If your buildings are 75 years old and they don't meet whatever requirements, then I would agree. We're going to have to take a look at what makes sense. I also believe that, we need to incentivize buildings to last the 25 years, and And I do believe, my own feeling is, it is, unless there's a compelling reason, you live with the design. You can't, I've seen people that come in and a new principal comes in the middle of discussion of construction and doesn't like the exact color paint or this or that, and people want changes. And we're always going to, every building's not going to be exactly as we want. So we're going to have to figure out whether or not it can be made serviceable. But so with that, it's been a future meeting. We're going to try and summarize sort of comments and consensus and see if we can't put everything together.
Legally, people out there probably want
Right.
to comment, especially after the.
Well, I'd like to move on actually to consolidating special programs. And I would like to encourage Cash, if you want to give us a position paper on it, to the extent we can have another full meeting on modernization, we're trying to get through a number of issues, fine, but you're more than welcome at any time to provide us with any information, and we'll make sure all the members get there. So I think the next topic really combines most of the information you've given us in terms of consolidating programs.
Yes, thank you. So the consolidating special programs, we've done the high-level overview of the special programs in meetings in the past and also in the agenda. Following this item, there are the detailed workings of each of the special programs, but what we wanted to focus on this item is just some big picture ideas of how the program could be consolidated to streamline, simplify. So this is not the detailed plan of how to do it, but just sort of the concept of where folks may want to go in the future on this one. And to start with, right now we have a number of different special programs within the SFP in addition to the main programs of new construction and modernization. There are actually 8 special programs in addition, and they're listed on page 25. And what we've tried to look at in this item is where these programs may fit the best. So in doing so, we've taken a look at what does new construction do, what does modernization do, looking at those as the 2 main programs. So we've outlined basically that new construction is adding capacity, adding new things to schools, and then modernization, we've just been talking about that. So I think that's got a number of definitions here. But we've provided an overview of what each of the programs does. In the interest of time, I can move forward to the options, and then if we have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So on page 28, we've got the first option there, the first method of consolidation, which addresses more of the funding issue as opposed to individual program requirements. So method 1 would consolidate funding sources but maintain the individual programs and their requirements. So you basically have 2 buckets of money. You'd have a new construction bucket of money and a modernization bucket of money. You'd keep all of your special programs, or you could pick and choose which ones to keep, but you would have your special programs still exist with their individual requirements, but they would draw from one of the 2 main buckets. And what this would help do is eliminate issues of too much funding for one program, too little funding for another. It puts sort of everything on an even playing field so that things are not tied up for future years or that they don't run out. We have tried to sort of sort the programs out in the middle of page 28 on the table there as far as what bucket they might fit into, but that's up for discussion too.
And just so I could understand that, so seismic, you would still have to qualify to pull out that money. So how would that bucket be different?
You'd just be drawing from the pot of new construction money.
Have a separate bucket.
So you wouldn't have $199 million. You'd just have.
So
Yeah.
if you blew through critically overcrowded schools, came in a whole bunch of applications before seismic use came in, seismic use wouldn't get anything.
Yes.
Or that matter, charter schools or anything like that.
If you keep the first in, first out method that currently exists in the program, yes.
The only problem I have with that is a lot of times people vote on these bonds because they find something in that bond they like, because they want to fund one component of that. And if you put it all like this, more likely these components aren't going to be funded at all, and therefore you may not get as much support on that.
True. It is a consideration.
But you could word it in such a way that after a certain period of time, like we went 5 years or 7 years and seismic wasn't use that the board can, after the stop period has a certain amount of time, if there's not applications, not desire, or something like that, then maybe have the flexibility built in to where you could consolidate or expand to another program that is getting more use.
But on the other hand, the reason you have seismic under, actually you'll be under new construction or modernization is because you have a school that has been determined is not safe to house kids. So if a school is not safe to house kids, you really should be then adding back in the eligibility for those students, and you've got to replace with new construction. So why do you need a separate pot of money? Why don't you just fund that out of your new construction dollars?
And that gets to method 2. That's sort of the concept there, is that you have the 2 main buckets of funding, new construction, modernization, and then you could collapse the different programs into it, and you wouldn't necessarily have to have specific program requirements. In addition to seismic, other programs that tend to fit there would be ORG, just sort of change what modernization could be used for, change the requirements and say that it can be used to replace portables. Career technical education, you can do career technical classrooms in new construction program, the program already. One of the things with using that method 2, and consolidating the programs is that the eligibility requirements are different for each of the special programs. So you'd have to figure out how to marry the eligibility requirements, because you may not have eligibility for new construction, but under the current structure you might be able to do a CTE project because it doesn't draw down on new construction eligibility. So option 2 would be basically expanding the types of things that would be considered new construction or modernization, but with that we may need to look at.
But you could have different eligibility for qualification within that bucket.
Yeah, so you could.
We don't have to stay in the same box in terms of eligibility.
Yeah, we could change the criteria to, match what the desires are. And then we also, in looking at that, that's the really high level overview of method 2 right there. But the other thing we've pointed out on page 30 are some programs that didn't seem to really fit well into consolidation efforts, and one would be the Charter School Facilities Program. And the reason we put that forth as not being a good fit is because it serves a specific group of people. It's not school districts typically, and all the rest of the special programs, there's a school district component there, so it may not be the best fit for consolidating because they have different challenges, whether they're financial or ability to submit the projects quickly due to a lack of a facilities department, or just even there may be a need for a school regardless of whether the district where they're located has unhoused pupils, things such as that. And then the other program that we've listed there is the Critically Overcrowded Schools Program, and the basis for not recommending that for consolidation is that it wasn't renewed in Proposition 1D, and it seems that there's been a move away from that. So we may not need to address that program since it's basically done.
Okay. Is there any public comment? None? Any comments from members here?
Like I said,
Oh,
I
there
still
is
have.
public- Okay, well, let's, come on up.
Sorry. Bill Oregon. I just wanted to comment on 2 things. Partly our experience with the HPI grants under Proposition 1D. And then I also wanted to share with you a funding model for high-performance schools from Massachusetts. So in terms of the first in, first out, I think that's proved to be a real challenge as far as the HPI grants, because with all of the considerations that school districts have to have, sort of doing something new and trying something that maybe isn't part of what they've done before has been, I think, a disincentive for school districts under Prop 1D taking advantage of that. I think the base incentive grants really helped with that historically, but I think what I would like to share with you is a possibility going forward. In Massachusetts, there's a school building authority very similar to the Office of School Construction called the Massachusetts School Building Authority. They've established a 2-tiered system. Their first tier is that they require all of their schools to be high performance. And then they also have an incentive program where they basically give a 1.5% incentive to schools that get to a higher level of high performance. And it's similar to the sort of the sliding scale approach that we currently have under the high performance incentive approach. And what they found is since they put in that requirement, the jump from the base level of, am I going to do a high-performance school, to a, am I going to go after the incentive, has really made a difference in terms of, it's a different decision. And so it's not so much a transformational decision as it is going after additional funding. And we would be happy to provide additional information on that particular option. I think it really would be warranted for us to look at. And their new guidelines have been in effect since March of 2011 and have really had a substantial effect in terms of school districts going after those incentive funds. So just wanted to share that with you.
Could you clarify something? In the Massachusetts program, so a school district has to build a LEED certified or CHIP certified building?
That's correct. So in Massachusetts, they have to build a high-performance school as a condition of getting the state funding. And then if they want to get the incentive funds, then they have to go to a higher level. And in that case, they either need to go for CHIPS verified leader, which is a higher level of CHIPS, or they have to build LEED silver with additional energy credits because they really wanted to have an energy emphasis. So that's what you need to do to get that additional incentive funding.
And see, I understand this, and I do have a little bit of issue because we already pay so much per square foot right now. I cannot believe the numbers we're paying for school districts. It far exceeds any other state for what we pay per square foot. So you want to go to the higher level. That means less schools are going to get funded, and a lot of the cases you talk about efficiencies that take out the operations, which I totally get as a school district, but we're using long-term bond dollars to pay for a cheaper electric bill when that probably should come out of operations because that's where they're saving it from to increase some of those things. That we augment some of that stuff, and we do have that. We do have pretty high standards for the schools already, but bring them up to that certain level. But for me, I try to distinguish the difference between the operational fund, the operations of the schools, and the capital improvements, because the capital is going to be over a long period of time. If we increase our cost per square foot by 10% to have more efficient buildings, that's great, but I'm saving it on the backside of operations because I'm not paying for electric, I'm not paying as much for water, cooling, where the case may go, but I'm also adding that to the bond costs, over here. So, how do I distinguish those two? How do I make that make sense so I still get the most out there? Because as our bond numbers go down, this will be less and less schools that are going to get the monies. I'm hoping for ideas from the audience of how to bring my cost per square foot down, not going up, so I can get more of these buildings done. And then if they could add some of their own, maybe we give a loan program or something like that where they could build it up to the higher level, but with that savings in operations, they pay back into it. That's one of the things I was trying to work into Prop 39, because I do think we could become a partner with them for long-term savings and operational costs, but it needs to be rotated back out over a period of time.
Well, I think you've touched on basically the chasm between the capital budget and the operating budget. And my experience in looking both in state construction and school construction is that we really are looking for a way to get people to make long-term wise decisions on the capital side. Admittedly, they're going to benefit the operating budget, but that's a good thing. And so I've seen efforts where there's been cost-sharing arrangements and things like that. Those can get really complicated really quickly. And I think if we can find a way to invest capital dollars that are going to save operating dollars that can go into the classroom, I think it's a good thing.
I think it's a good thing, and I think ultimately we're going to get down to deciding what the demand is, what we can afford, and whether or not we can do that. I mean, a state like Massachusetts funds its schools very differently than a state like California. And if we could fund our schools like Massachusetts, I'd be there in a heartbeat.
You mean on the operating side as well as capital?
At both sides, that's exactly right, because it's still a property tax-based.
This is also getting to the issue, however, of first costs. And I think it also lends itself to the discussion of, are we building 30-year buildings, 45-year buildings, 50-year buildings? And sometimes that means that you invest more in the beginning than you would have, but you get the usage of that over time to a greater level. I mean, isn't that the basic premise of high performance? We want high-performing buildings, and it seems to me that high-performing buildings are actually the baseline, and that we should be constructing high-performing buildings.
They should be the baseline. I don't think high performance necessarily means longer life cycle. Because I think what high performance means is buildings that are more efficient to operate, as Mr. Hagman said. So on your general fund operational side of the budget, you see improvements, and you also see, when you were talking about lighting earlier, you see more natural light and hopefully a better learning environment. But I don't think that high performance necessarily means that a building lasts longer. It means that they're more efficient to operate and you have other savings there.
It could. And
Well,
I
but so
actually,
is any
I think
building-
from a reality standpoint, I think we should be thinking of 50-year buildings, not 25-year buildings. So whether or not a given...
But even in a 50-year building, you're probably replacing
Absolutely.
lights and doing that same kind of maintenance. I mean, our district went to metal roofs because they last longer, but,
And that's the life cycle part, whether
Right.
it's the HVAC system or
Right.
the roofing systems, you're going to have those expected lifetimes. And that, if you roll that all together, then that becomes the high-performance school.
So I think we are heading in California towards a standard where everything is going to be high performance by the code requirements that are changing. The Cal Green Code is really in its infancy, but it's being increased and further pushing the costs up, as Mr. Hagen is concerned about, but also creating a higher standard for every single school. And we've got our Title 24 standards that just the last version, in comparison to the previous one, the one that's in place now, is almost 25% higher in terms of the energy efficiency requirements. And everyone has to meet those requirements. So we're kind of getting to a point where a high-performance school is what you have to build, and we'll be there in 10 years easily, I think, if we keep going.
Are there anyone else, Kathy, who wants to comment?
Kathy Allen, Sac City. So I'm having a little problem wrapping my head around this, and I think, as we usually say, the devil's in the details, trying to figure out how it would work. And what I did today before I came over was tallied up how many and how much Sac City's been able to access because of these special programs. And we've been very fortunate. And even in San Juan, my former district, 3 very successful career tech programs on one of our high school campuses that I would be willing to bet that we would not have attempted to do those without that funding available. So in terms of still being able to access, I just don't know how that would work. So again, devil's in the details. But, we've done, of the items that are listed here, other than seismic and facility hardship, we've done every one of these and received money from every one of them, done some beautiful things.
And you understand the proposal is not to eliminate the program. The proposal is to have one big pot. So theoretically, you could fund more out of it, or you could, you'd have less, but you'd have one pot, so you wouldn't end up with $100 million left over in one when you need more money in another.
Right. And like I said, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it and figure
Right.
out how it would work. And although this will probably be unpopular, I think we need another program called ADA improvements, because that seems to be where the majority of my money goes. So
That's where the majority of everyone's
my little
money
plug
goes.
there for dollars for ADA improvements. Thank you.
Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. I actually wanted to say I appreciate staff's work so much. They've put an awesome amount of time, I think, in coming up with some alternatives, and I think all school districts in the state ultimately will benefit from it. I appreciate the committee actually having this kind of forum and allowing for this type of discussion, and actually want to appreciate Mrs. Moore, because I want to echo her comments, because I think she's hit the nail on the head here, right? And we're talking about roofs, we're talking about heating systems, we're talking about classroom configurations, but it's all for the benefit of educating kids. And so if we don't have a lens that talks about what we do as something broader and more impactful than just keeping a 960 square foot box warm, then we're not actually accomplishing anything. And so I think we always have to have the lens that she put on it, that ultimately in this type of learning environment, given the competitive nature of the marketplace, we can't have schools that that my grandmother went to and expect for my daughter to learn in those kind of environments. And as we continue to talk about buildings again are no different than devices, and they are part of the learning environment. And so I think we really need to give some serious consideration, not to just what you help locals provide with their own money, but what are we looking for in terms of outcomes from those facilities. And that's really what we're here trying to talk about, because unless you actually get better outcomes, municipalities will always be here knocking at your door for money, because until we actually change the outcomes, you're not going to be able to support yourself locally.
Well, the problem is that I see is, well, I agree with you. You have to make those decisions locally.
Right, and we don't want you to make those decisions.
I can't tell you.
But we want you to support
schools are going to
those.
get you the best outcomes. So I
That's right.
think we're in agreement. We talked about it with new construction. We talked about it with modernization in terms of giving you flexibility so we don't put you in a box. The discussion we have now is, should we create a box of money for each type of program, or should we consolidate and say, okay, my seismic example, if you have a school that's not safe to house kids for seismic purposes, and we're going to give you money for new construction, should I put aside X dollars for seismic with new construction and Y dollars for new construction, or should I allow that be a condition for which you would qualify for new construction dollars, and I've got one pot? That's the question that we're trying to deal with now, because what happens if not is, if all my seismic dollars are spent and now you've got a problem, you don't qualify for anything.
Right.
Conversely, if we only use half of those dollars, now I have money left over, but you need money for new construction or modernization, and I've got money in a pot here that I can't transfer. So the proposal is, should there be some kind of consolidation? Right. And I know, just like with Kathy coming up, everyone's going to look at what their district got, and they're going to make their pass judgment on the recommendation based on, is this best for me, which is what we should be doing. But I think the question that we're trying to answer is would it be a better way of streamlining it to be able to say, ultimately we have to have a discussion over which programs we want to fund. I think we bring up valid comments on the critically overcrowded schools. We've been transferring some of that money into new construction. We didn't fund the program in 1D. Maybe we don't need that, but which of these programs do we need to fund? And then should we fund it out of one big pot, or should we limit to specific dollar amounts?
Right. I want to encourage you to continue to look at these options, and to a certain degree, you have to consider conditional analysis, I think, in a set of facilities, because those are the type of environments that either help kids succeed or not succeed. And ultimately, whether we're here talking about buildings or we're talking about the kids in those buildings, we're really here for their educational outcome.
Right. Thank you. Are there any other?
Good afternoon. I'm Alice Sung, principal of Green Bank Associates, but I come here to speak to you with two hats on, one as the Oakland Unified High Performance Schools Program Manager, and the other as USGBC California Green Schools Advocate. And I'm here just briefly to speak in support of the High Performance Schools Incentive Grant Program. We've been a great beneficiary of that program since its inception, and I want to say two things. You've all heard about the great benefits from not only operating cost savings, but also health benefits and the academic performance relationship between school environments that are high performance and actual performance and attendance for the benefit of kids. But I think we're all in agreement here that we support Senator Hancock's statement when she says all public schools should be high-performance schools, right? And this is so relevant to the conversation. So I think I support consolidating the program. What I would urge you to consider is a couple of things. One is to ensure that the funding level is as much as it has been in the past, and particularly in consideration of the base incentive grant funding. That was actually a turning point, I think, in the program, and that helped actually make the decision, if you will, for a lot of school districts to actually go after the money and actually raise the quality of their performance. So in consideration of that, if you're going to consolidate, make sure that you do have enough to continue to provide the base incentive grant level. And tagging on to Bill Orr's comment about the Massachusetts two-tiered level, I'm throwing this out in consideration. When you look at the funding levels, if you're going to look at that as part of whether you have new construction and modernization or just two pots or whatever, look at base incentive grant level as the base tier 1, maybe, and then reward higher scoring, high performance levels with the extra incentive grant funding up to 10% of whatever you're going to fund. So I beg you to take that under consideration. And the other point that I wanted to make was we have this one-time opportunity, I think, at this juncture to leverage the Proposition 39 implementation funding, which is going to come down pretty soon for all of these energy efficiency projects, towards whatever future bond funding is going to happen, right, with high-performance schools. And we have the opportunity to leverage high-performance school dollars incentives, with the Prop 39 funding. So I think there's this huge opportunity to not backslide and do away with the program and lose the ground that we've gained, but to move forward and actually get a paradigm shift to actually achieving all schools being high-performance schools with the leveraging of the Prop 39 funding. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. So,
Well,
go ahead.
I feel like I've become my father. I've lived long enough to see things return to where they began.
That's right.
And where we began was new construction and modernization. And then we went into these different programs, I think mainly because of just like how categoricals got put into place, because people felt that without that reservation, those types of projects would not be accomplished. Particularly with critically overcrowded schools and the overcrowded relief grant, I think that was really addressing an urban issue. It wasn't only urban, but it was addressing an urban issue and created a greater pie, as you talked about, a greater partnership. So it's with some trepidation. I think it's great that you looked at how we could consolidate them, but it also puts them at competition for limited dollars, and maybe that's what we want to be doing. But it is going full circle back to two basic programs with some of with let's not say two basic programs, two basic funding pieces with numerous programs within them that would have to compete with one another for funding. So, like you said, if all new construction came in and day one, nothing else would be funded. And I think we have to think carefully about that.
If you put all the bond pots of money together, how much money total was there?
I believe in all bonds,
Yeah,
about $35 billion.
about $35 billion. And what are you going to have left over residue in these pots of money that we're talking about right now?
Right now, we have about $400 million remaining in bond authority.
Okay, I'm talking about the stuff that's going to be left over, like we have HBI, it's roughly 35
Some of that
minus
we've got
7
to
or
do.
8. Yeah, and so when you talk and it's all said and done, the 0.001% leftover residual, I think there's not a problem here we need to solve. I think the reason why those different segments were in there, like I said, a lot of my voters probably won't vote for a bond unless they did have charter school in there. Some areas aren't going to vote for it unless they do have seismic activity. I think the way you fix the leftover is you get down to a certain percentage of your pot of money or your allocated money. When it gets down below 5–10%, you give, in the bond language, the authority for the board to make the recommendation that gets consolidated with the biggest need they see, 7–8 years later. I think that's how you shift the balance left over. There's not a lot of money left over when you fully allocate it out. We have talking about, I think, less than $100 million of the different pots that I remember that have not gone out on that. So I don't know if there's a problem there that needs to be solved, first of all. And secondly, I think if we just have it such a big pot of money, then it may streamline the application process, but those who are have the ability to apply and take advantage of the grants. It's like we see now, the larger districts get the larger proportion, bigger than what the percentage of population is, generally because they're much more tooled up to do that. And the smaller districts, the smaller schools and such, and the same discussions we have in Prop 39, that's why we have the minimum funding for certain schools and stuff, are not going to be able to compete and not be able to respond quickly enough to be in competition for some of these things. And that's what I'm afraid of if you put it all in two big pots of money. I think you could change the language so you get the residual effects. So, hey, we got 30 million over here and 25 million over here. There's obviously more need in new construction or modernization. Let's transfer it over after a certain portion, maybe a date specific, if it's not allocated by a certain time, or a certain level when you fund, or a combination of that. You put those triggers that give the flexibility into legislature, the board, whatever you want to do, to sit there and move that pot of money over and not have it so stringent in the bond thing. But I think about having those key categories is going to be hard to sell to the majority of Californians to vote on in the first place, and I'm concerned if you make it too blunt, it's not going to be there.
There's a part of me that could live with either way. I don't think when people vote they know exactly how much money is in one pot versus another. They know what projects are going to be eligible for bond money. So the question becomes whether we think there should be any additional flexibility or specific amounts set aside. I do think we're going to end up having to have a discussion, though, on some of these programs, and I'll bring up a couple of them, the critically overcrowded schools. I mean, that money we've been transferring to new construction, the leftover money, it wasn't funded through 1D, do we still need that program? I bring up the overcrowded relief grant. It's been a little bit slower, but it looks like we're going to spend all the money from it now. But if we decide to do something with portable replacement, that may
Fall in there.
take care of the need to have overcrowded relief grants. So I do think, whether we consolidate in one, like I said, to me, seismic, if you've got to replace a school, it's new construction. So whether you leave it separate, whether you combine it, if you're planning new construction, to have an add-on for high performance certainly makes sense. Whether you have to have that add-on come out of a certain pot, and then when you're done with that pot, we don't fund it anymore, or whether it's an add-on like we add on with fire, life safety, and others. We can have a conversation about that, but combining doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to fund it. And it's not a sword I'm going to fall on one way or another, but I do think we need to have some discussions around at some point in time when we start trying to put everything together that we've discussed around some of these programs and whether or not they're still needed.
One of the things I had problems with, we had this discussion last time too, was just because you fund some of the seismic, why isn't it funded to the same level or standard that you expect for modernization or for new construction too? If you're going to do a project, do it all the way, basically, not just the minimum needed to do it to get at that certain standard. So I would also look at the language on that. If you tear up the walls to fix the structure to get seismic there, you should be able to get it modernized enough to where maybe the combination of using multiple pots, maybe seismic goes up to 40%, and then 6% comes from modernization because it qualifies for both. I don't know.
That's the way the system currently works. It would come from different pots.
I would just comment that I really like your idea about, and we did it, I think, pretty successfully in the critically overcrowded schools, as if it isn't used by some point in time, that it can roll, and it's not a 2/3 vote of the legislature in order to do that it's something that can be more nimble to account for over or underestimations of need. So I would support that, and I would support streamlining to the extent that we can, but I do think we have to have a collaborative or a partnership approach of different interests in order to pass a bond measure.
Yes, one more comment, and then I think if there's any other, I've been trying to take public comment on each topic so it's relevant, but if there's any other public comment, then we will go ahead and adjourn. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. I wanted to just add to, since we seem to be talking about the high performance incentive grant funding and the residual 30-some million, I was just going to say, I think that one of the reasons that it has been lagging in uptake is because of the timing and the timing of the base incentive grant funding, but that there are unfunded approvals that are waiting for that funding that can't access it because the mod and the new construction eligibility is gone. So we realize that. So if there was that uptake, we could use it now. And I assume that was the topic last week?
That was the topic last week.
And did we decide to
No,
release the funding?
we've got we're dealing with what the legal limitations are, which ties into having some flexibility, because we've got them coming back to us with answers, because it's the way the bond language was written, and it's in terms of what we can do either in terms of regulation or legislation to be able to move the money forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because there are projects.
It seems
waiting
really
to
simple.
HPI eligible.
It seems really simple, but we're running into, some legal issues that make it more complex in terms of whether or not we need legislation to fix it. What are there limitations around the actual bond wording that limits it and what we do? But I think everyone was in consensus at that meeting that we wanted to do all we could to get the HPI money out to projects.
Thank you so much. And last suggestion in listening to this discussion, perhaps it's not the programs that need consolidation. Perhaps it's just the pot.
That's what the proposal is. That's what the proposal is, to consolidate the pot and not the programs. But
thank you.
All right. Is there any other closing comments from members? We're going to. We've got a number of meetings for this fall, to try and see if we can't eventually take everything we've talked about and discussed and try and get it into one sort of report we can all comment on and give something to the full committee. So we're adjourned, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.